Well, friends, welcome back to this week's episode of the Bold by Choice podcast. And we're looking at a few interesting things this season around governance. And one of the things we're going to talk about is that boards rarely become unhealthy overnight. In fact, sometimes these unhealthy governance cultures begin with some of the very things that once made a school and their board really strong. Things like trust, things like loyalty and sacrifice, and a deep belief in the school's mission. And over time, if boards are not intentional, those strengths can slowly harden into unhealthy patterns. And we're going to be unpacking some of that today. Power can sometimes become concentrated to a couple of folks who've been around a while or hold higher positions. Sometimes hard questions actually become uncomfortable and sometimes not even asked, and new voices may struggle to emerge. So today's conversation is about governance maturity, what it takes for boards to evolve as schools grow, and the courage required to continue to govern very honestly. Now, this season, we are joined by our colleagues, which are familiar voices to all of you from the National Charter Schools Institute leadership team. And today, Heather Wendling, our VP of Professional Services, is back with us. Heather, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Vashaunta.
I'm so glad to have you on today. I know you have been training boards, observing boards in very different ways across your career. And I wanted to start with this. Can you share an example of when a board began to experience some tensions?
Yes. So you're right. I've seen a lot of really great work. I've seen some struggles and everything in between with my work with various boards. But in terms of a story that really illustrates the arc of what you were just describing, there's one particular charter school board that comes to mind. So I'll give you a little bit of that backstory. So like a lot of charter schools do, they start off with a really scrappy group of people who deeply believe in an idea, and they're willing to work nonstop to make that happen. So this was kind of adjacent to the neighborhood that I grew up in, which is one of the reasons why I kind of know so much about it. But there had been a building that had been sitting empty. It had kind of become, a sort of neighborhood eyesore. Families in surrounding communities kind of felt overlooked. There were a lot of students leaving the various school options, but not excited about what they were going to be doing next. Some of them experienced disconnection. Some of them just kind of felt underserved or just underinspired. So there came a time that, one of the really experienced and beloved teachers in the community just kind of like rallied a small group of folks and like described a vision for what could be better or something that could be better. So the people that joined, that with enthusiasm and, rallied behind this teacher, they became board members. But even from the very beginning, they were more than board members. They were very, very personally invested in the small and the big ways, right? Which we still see, time to time for these sort of mom and pop, charter school startups. They're painting classrooms before the first day of school. Mm-hmm. They're recruiting families through word of mouth, at churches, at community fairs, and, at softball practice and those types of things. The board chair, was taking home budgets at night and then spending weekends assembling furniture, so really, really involved in every aspect of things. The school leader, so that teacher that ultimately became the school leader and the founding board chair became super, super close, through those years of, problem solving, the shared commitment, the sacrifices, and that great figure it out mentality. And that closeness in the early years seemed to be really the recipe for success, for this particular school. The board moved pretty quickly. They made decisions fast. Everybody trusted each other. They relied less on formal governance structures because the priority was getting things going, and things seemed to be, going generally pretty well. So people didn't really question it. They didn't question themselves. But as the school grew past that, sort of startup phase, the governance structures didn't figure themselves out, right? And that, I think, is a key learning, even when there are people that are really, really super committed and that are super smart. Without structures and systems, you can only overcompensate so far through like gut commitment. So 10 years in, the charter school is open, doing relatively well. They have like 900 plus students enrolled at this point. Strong reputation in the community. Wait list every year. On paper, everything looked stable. Inside board meetings, though, the culture had merged or just evolved or devolved into something pretty unhealthy, especially in contrast to how positive and, committed and passionate the folks were in those early days to get the school off the ground. So the board chair still operated in a lot of the same ways that she had in year one. She set and controlled the agendas, would speak first and last basically on every issue, would interrupt discussion too to get things back on track in the direction that she thought they should go. And in a lot of ways, consciously or subconsciously shaped a lot of decisions before meetings even started or before all her, trustee colleagues really had a chance to weigh in. A lot of members respected her too much to push back. Others just stopped trying, and sort of disengaged. So it stopped functioning like a governing body and really functioned like an inner circle of two. It was just the board chair and the school leader. So that line, too, between governance and personal relationship, became blurred. Several of the board members were taking family vacations, with each other and the school leader. They texted and were in constant contact, on an ongoing basis every day. Meetings felt more like social check-ins or, formalities rather than strategic discussion-based meetings. And asking hard questions, especially if you weren't in that inner circle, felt really uncomfortable. So anything that really approached accountability seemed more personal than professional. So here's really where, you can probably feel the tension building, across this, anecdote.
Yeah.
But this is really where it started to become problematic in ways that I think everyone across the school community started to feel. So academic concerns, emerged in one grade band. But the culture had already been set that if you weren't the board chair, you didn't really push too hard, and if you pushed hard, it was probably with your personal relationship with that school leader. Then there were some financial projections, that tightened for upcoming years. And members also kind of softened their questions because they didn't want to appear to be unsupportive or to think that the school was on a downward spiral. So the stories that people tell themselves in a lot of scenarios like this, and this was certainly true of this scenario, people will say this board is family. We trust each other. We built this together. We'll get through it together. But underneath a lot of that was avoidance, right? They were very practiced and just used to avoiding conflict, avoiding difficult conversations, and anything that might, create additional tension or instability, or even call attention to the tension or instability that was already there.
Mm-hmm.
Then, so this is the board is kind of stagnating in this space, now for a while. And then a new board member joined, replaced somebody that had retired from the board. So this new board member was really thoughtful, was experienced both on the ed and sort of the business side, really committed to the mission. Her background was much needed at the board. She was a financial and organizational leadership person in her full-time career, had a lot to contribute. But immediately, she was voted in, and from her first meeting onwards, she was made to feel like an outsider. So they referenced years of history or things that had happened previously that she didn't know, and nobody would fill her in. Other board members were using acronyms and shorthand terms that she didn't know or that were not explained. A lot of important conversations or, sort of preliminary decisions seemed to have been made before meetings even started. And whenever she raised questions, either to seek to understand or, to drive conversation further, the room became really uncomfortable. Not hostile, not rude, just sort of resistant to the new energy and the new attention that she wanted to bring to what she saw as emergent issues. So after one of these meetings, another member kind of took her aside and was like, that's not really how things work on this board. So the message there was clear. We observe first, we don't challenge too much, and we fall in line because we're supporting the school. This is what we do. So eventually she became quieter. The board just kept on operating the same way it always had until a crisis came. And it wasn't something in the newspapers. It wasn't that type of scandal. It was something pretty common, but that this school and this board was completely unprepared for. The school leader, who had been the founder and had been through this, everyone through thick and thin, announced their plan to retire at the end of that year.
Mm.
And all of a sudden, the board realized how unprepared they really were. There was no succession plan, perhaps really surprisingly, that had never really been discussed. It's maybe also surprising how common that is, that boards really do resist thinking and planning for succession because there's this idea that the founder's never going to go anywhere. So they had no leadership pipeline, and the governance, committees and all these things were not structured strong enough to function independently of that inner circle of two of the founding school leader and the board chair. So the board chair immediately tried to take even more control, right? But for the first time, some of the other board members were hesitant and were thinking maybe this is not the best way forward. So they started to ask questions that they had avoided for far too long already. So what is their role? Had they confused their sometimes blind support with their oversight role? Was everyone on the board feeling empowered to lead, and what opportunities had they been missing, by not delegating, responsibilities across membership? And how is this school and how would this board sustain itself without that founding school leader? But they were also probably more honest than they had been since those really, really early days of startup.
Mm-hmm.
So they realized they needed help. They brought in some governance trainers. They sat down, the governance consultants and trainers had the members sit down with the bylaws and read them word for word and, revisit their core responsibilities, mission of the school, performance frameworks. They went back to the basics. Committee structures were revisited and made more clear. The board chair agreed that she had to transition leadership responsibilities and really stuck to it. I think hearing, some external experts break down the strengths and weaknesses of the board was really transformational for these folks. New members or anyone that had been on the board for fewer than 2 years, were paired with a more veteran trustee on the board as a mentor, which, got them up to speed much more quickly and also eased the way for them to participate, in real ways. Mm-hmm. So meetings became strategic and formal and less driven by the strongest personalities in the room. So that caused a really much needed culture shift. The people still cared about each other. They didn't stop caring about each other. They didn't lose, those personal connections that did drive them and brought them together. But they did realize that healthy governance requires more than trust and loyalty, that they're doing the school a disservice as well as their board colleagues if they're not willing to just sit up and ask the difficult questions and listen to the answers, share responsibility, share power, create space for the new voices and perspectives, from people coming onto the board and adding something new. So this is how, they obviously experienced a lot of tensions, over the course of, this really a 10-year, sort of arc here. Became very, very uncomfortable. But then ultimately they were able to turn it around, even in that period of a lot of angst, when that leader left, and they finally found someone else to bring in, and they had to support and they had to rally around that new person. But the passionate efforts that started the school, and a small group of super committed people found their way, into something that's ultimately more sustainable, and that they can, continue carrying this mission forward, even when these trustees and this new leader, eventually all these people will have some type of transition. But it is it's nice to be able to say that the school is still doing well. I think that they are now much more comfortable in terms of the systems of governance, and they learned, some hard lessons, over the course of that.
I love that you brought such a colorful example to us because I think we could all agree, probably, as we engage in board trainings and engage with boards, so many things can happen prior to an external party coming in, right? And then trying to figure out how to be the most useful. And we talk about in this season the tensions that sometimes show up with boards, not to be negative Nancy's, but we're calling them out so that we can actually think about strategies and think about solutions that for those of you out there, this may be occurring for you and your boards, and you can use. And Heather, one of the things I hear or I heard you say in a training you did recently, were there some common things that boards get wrong? And then you have some strategies to go along with that. Let's talk about that. What are some of the things that you've seen boards often get wrong?
So yeah, that's an approach that I typically try to put into trainings because I think that it's important to humanize governance, right? And that I think there are relatively few perfect boards, but a lot, fortunately, of good ones. So I think that the practice of self-reflection and admitting when things could be better is an important lens. And I try to bring that to boards' attention. So what boards often get wrong, sometimes it's the avoidance of ultimate responsibility, right? I think when things get tough, sometimes, I've heard from boards like, well, we're just volunteers. Well, you're volunteers that are entrusted with public funds and the education of children. So you have automatically signed yourself up for one of the highest stakes volunteer positions you possibly could have. So I think there's something even just about the acceptance of responsibility. And secondly, such as in that, that kind of recollection I just shared with you about that particular school, a lot of boards are not really harnessing the full value of their collective, membership composition because for whatever reason, sometimes it's availability or sometimes it's, mixed levels of understanding of certain content areas. But a lot of boards are not fully benefiting from the skill sets of the folks around the table, so making sure that folks are really involved and giving them the level of information that makes it comfortable for them to dig in and ask questions and, help with the analysis. I think that those are also like some weaknesses I see pretty frequently in boards that can be improved upon, with some, sometimes it's additional help, sometimes it's just more time, or sometimes it's just making really concerted efforts to ask other people to weigh in rather than letting them, kind of sit quietly.
Heather, let's talk about just a volunteer, right? Justas don't win championships, and Justa is kind of an excuse. When board members are managing multi-million-dollar school organizations, right? You talked about kids, but we talk about it as stewardship. You don't own it, but you care for it, and you got to protect and ensure that it's ready to serve in the years that are coming, because these schools are so important to students and families and transformation. So how do you get somebody that actually is volunteering their time to see their role as so important that they're not just a
lot of that goes to comprehensive onboarding, right? As well as probably even prior to onboarding is in terms of recruitment, right? Because schools are not looking for people that, are free an evening a month to attend a meeting and chat, right? The requirements of the board members are so much deeper than that. So being upfront about the responsibility and the opportunity, that boards need to provide to schools is really key, as well as onboarding in terms of here's the type of data that we're going to be receiving every month. Here's how we discuss it. Here's, the different skill sets across the board. And, here's how they all weigh into decision making. Onboarding is really key to getting the right people around the table and setting them up for success so they can actively assist in governance.
That's such an important key, because I think what people come to realize one way or the other is that the job of the board is to make sure the organization delivers superior performance for kids and for the people it serves. And so the role of a board is to make organizational decisions, not individual decisions.
Yep.
Absolutely. And Jim, one thing I'd love Heather to elaborate on too, and I think this is an awesome solution, is about communication routines. Heather, what are some
Mm.
healthy governance communication routines that boards could think about?
This could also, we could reframe this question to think about what times, what do boards get wrong, right? Or what do they, mischaracterize? So often I've heard boards talk about that they're in constant communication with the principal or the director of ops, and they'll cite things like, oh, we text every single day, or we talk on the phone every single morning and every single night, or maybe not as frequent as that, right? Or we talk 2-3 times a week. Whenever I hear that, people are saying it in ways that they think is like really impressive, that they're showing their level of commitment and their level of like almost spontaneous, information sharing. It doesn't read that way to me, or it doesn't sound like that to me, right? It sounds like there are underdeveloped formal information communication sharing patterns, right? That need to be put in, both in terms of sustainability, right? For work-life balance, for all those great things, right? That we want our school leaders and we want our school staff also, to feel that they are not tethered to a board member at all times and, always reporting. So communication routines have to feel reasonable to both school leadership and the board, right? If a board constantly feels they're not being given enough information, that's a red flag, right? So that should definitely be addressed, but there should be some parameters put in place, whether it's, a data upload, or there's some type of reporting that board members want access to on a weekly or monthly basis, right? Depending on the certain situation, I could see both of those being practical and realistic. But if everyone needs to be in constant contact with the school leader, on a daily or even more frequent basis, that speaks that they have not put a healthy communication strategy in place, and that should definitely be looked at.
Heather, I'm going to amp that up. To me, it sounds like they lack trust and confidence in their leader.
Yeah, could be. Or they also just are not staying in their lane of oversight versus management, right? Which is also
Well,
something
worse,
we.
their leader's got a school to run, and if they're communicating
Mhm.
every day with board members, they
Yeah.
can't focus on their primary mission.
Yes.
So
Agree.
there's
Yeah.
a lot there to that.
Mm-hmm.
And
I,
the thing about boards is boards look really good when they got a great leader, because great leaders know how to
mhm.
win for kids. Um, you want to drive great leaders away, you start doing that to them.
Mm-hmm. And I think some actually think that it's a form of support. But again, I think that's just about, leaders feeling comfortable, asserting themselves and talking about, right, like, what is this taking away from my attention from teaching and learning?
Yeah.
And why is the board insecure that they need to be in touch so often?
Well, all board members that are hearing this, if that's what you're thinking, there's a saying that says the road to some place is paved with good intentions. They might be good intentions, but that's not how you want to have an amazing school.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
if that's your practice, boy, let's figure out how to back you out of it and get reset, because that won't be good for your board. It won't be good for your leaders, and it
Mm-hmm.
won't be great for your kids, because that's not how great organizations function.
Yep.
Absolutely. What I love about the board I sit on, many of you know, I currently serve, and some of the kind of practical steps that we take. We are in like school opening zone, right? Year zero. So we're not operating yet. But we have a weekly Friday email where we get some pertinent updates from our school leader. And we worked as a team to decide what categories go in that email every Friday. Now, that won't continue once the school opens, right? We're in school opening mode. So there are some more frequent needs at this point in time than there will be after August. The other piece that I really love are our committee structures. So we have committees that focus deeply on some important topics, and those groups email with our board chair and our school leader. We have prep calls for our formal monthly meeting, and we do have our school leader and superintendent there. And then, of course, our board meeting. So it's starting to prep us for what does that communication look like with and among and between the board and the leaders, but also giving the leaders space because they are building a school right now. And so those are just some things like I am practicing. And so if that's helpful to some of our listeners out there, want to always share some practical tips.
Yeah, Vashaunta, your board, I think, you all could be a really great case study about what healthy power sharing looks like, and setting up all of those routines in advance. There is also, because I've interacted with your board a little bit, there is a sense of just preparation and calm.
Yes.
There's just some softer skills that are really apparent in the way that you guys conduct governance. So it's really great.
Heather, that's so key you pointed that out because Covey talks about time in the 4 quadrants. And the quadrant that he recommends we get in, but is particularly important for boards, is it's important, but it's not urgent. Mm-hmm. So you can have some calm, but that's the realm of governance. If it's urgent, that's probably the realm of management.
That's right. Well, Jim, we have these fancy Bold by Choice conversation card deck. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to pull out a card for us for this. Look at that fancy box.
Here we go.
All right. So what's our topic and our question for this week?
All right, here it is. The Bold by Choice card pull. How can we highlight our mission, our people, and student success in ways that equip students, families, and educators to become authentic advocates?
Well, you guys are thinking, I have not practiced this, but I have heard about it and I love it. There are some boards who have students, whether it's the students that serve on the SGA at the school, the Student Government Association, or if it's student ambassadors that help do orientations or school tours. But there's a way in which schools have chosen students, and those students get onboarded and trained in a way to actually attend and present at every board meeting. And so they are basically bringing the student experience, student life, student voice to the board meeting. And I want to practice that, once we have students and we're operable. I have heard how powerful that is, one, for the students and empowering them along their leadership journey and their voice. But two, I think it helps board members to see past the paperwork and to the impact. And that is something I think is grounding. And I think it becomes this natural, organic, authentic way for board members to then have this additional way to advocate for those exact same students.
Vashaunta, I love that. And I'm just thinking about our experience at the West Michigan Aviation Academy. Mm-hmm. And when the adults go through there, who comes up, looks you in the eye, and shakes your hand and welcomes you to the school?
Mm-hmm. The students.
Yep. The students. So imagine an entrepreneurial school leader that says, you know what, we're going to have students at each board meeting. When the board member walks through the door, they're going to welcome them. They're going to look them in the eye. They're going to give them a handshake and say, thank you for serving on our board. And we're so glad you look so professional tonight. You're modeling the way for us. And I'm sure you're prepared just like we have to be for class. And let's rock this meeting.
I would like to see boards be more proactively welcoming to students, families, and educators to governance meetings, right? There's so much rich information shared. There's so much perspective also that could be gained. But when I think back to my days when I was a teacher, when I was an instructional coach, and when I was working in schools, I never considered attending a board meeting, not even once. Because I didn't really know what was discussed. I didn't know what the space would be for me there. I didn't know if I knew they were open legally, but I didn't feel that they were open in a practical way. So I think in terms of really developing strong advocates, I love the idea of using students, in all various ways, especially of them showing off what they're learning and how they're developing in the school. But if we could just be more open about, highlights, performance data, how money is being spent, to keep the school going by involving people, either in meetings or turning minutes or turning board newsletters into something that's like a little bit more, accessible to external stakeholders. I think that's a missed opportunity.
Vashaunta, one thing every board could do, and they could get started right away if they're not, is opening their meetings with a mission moment.
Mm-hmm.
And just having something about the mission right there at the beginning. Students could do that, families could do it, people that work at the school could do it, board member could do it, right? But that's just an easy one, and it's a great way to ground the purpose each time. I also think that board meetings are often associated with being boring. I think we just need to acknowledge that. Why are board meetings thought of as boring? Because they're usually talking about the past. They're usually getting reports. They're usually like, interesting, right? But if you think about governance as where's the puck going to be? Where should we be positioning? Why should we be doing that? How does it relate to our values? And really make it forward looking. It'd be a dynamic event that people would want to be at because they'd be hearing the insights into what do we think the future is going to be? Why do we think we need to be positioned there? How can we be the best in the world at what we do? Yeah. And all of a sudden, that board meeting shifts from being boring to really forward looking.
Absolutely. And that is a great segue to this week's boardroom moment. So, boards out there, we want to ask you to think about this when you go to your next meeting. What structures, routines, or habits are you intentionally building so that you can strengthen trust, clarity, and healthy governance over time? Because we've just unpacked, governance requires more than relationships, more than goodwill. Those are great pieces of the recipe. But it also requires concrete practices that foster clear communication, power sharing, and the welcoming of new voices so that tension can be navigated productively if it shows up, or better yet, avoided. We really want to encourage healthy board cultures, and they do not emerge by accident. They are built by choice. Jim, any closing reflections before we head to the end today?
Excellence doesn't happen by accident. And the boards play an important role in design and in governing and in stewardship. And so we give that riddle, is trust earned or is it given? And the reality is a new board, trust's given to them, but it's reserved trust, right? So how do they earn trust? Well, all the proof says the way you earn trust is do what you say you will do. And that's why we say boards have to model the way. They have to provide that governance stewardship. And when they do that, they build credibility. That credibility attracts great talent, attracts students and families, attracts future board members. It attracts what we like to call greatness. And what's greatness? We're delivering superior performance, we're making a distinctive impact, and we're building lasting endurance. That's a winning formula for every board.
Absolutely. Well, Heather, thank you so much for joining us again here on the Bold by Choice podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Well, friends, you are more than welcome to stay with us. In fact, we invite you to go ahead and click that subscribe button if you have not done so already. Stay with us. Make sure that you get updates for every episode coming out every week live. You don't want to miss it. And we are talking about board governance, leadership decisions, and tensions on this season. So stay with us so that we continue to unpack and explore what becomes possible for students and communities when we govern really, really well. Well, until next time, stay bold, and we'll see you next week.